My parents kicked me out and made it clear I wasn't family until I inherited $10 million. Suddenly, I was their favorite child. I've always been the odd one out in my family. Growing up, it felt like I had to carve out my own little corner, like I didn't quite belong. I know it sounds dramatic, but when you're just a kid trying to figure out where you fit in, it's a lot to deal with. I think it started when my mom, Linda, remarried Jim. Now, don't get me wrong. Jim wasn't some cartoonishly evil stepdad. He was steady, provided for the family, and kept to himself. But he also never really made me feel like part of his world, and no one else in the house did either. There were three of us kids. Chad, my half-brother from Mom and Jim. Andy, my younger brother from Mom's first marriage, just like me. Then, of course, there was me, the middle child who somehow didn't seem to fit anywhere. Chad was Jim's pride and joy, and it wasn't subtle. I can't remember a time when Jim wasn't bragging about how talented Chad was, or doting on him like he was the family's golden child. Meanwhile, I sat there, in the background, wondering what was wrong with me, why I wasn't good enough. To be fair, my mom wasn't exactly innocent in all this either. She avoided conflict like it was her life's mission, even if that meant siding with Jim and throwing me under the bus. Over time, I just started fading into the background, feeling more like a tenant in their home than part of the family. Andy was my saving grace for a while. Being the youngest, he didn't get the same pressure I did. We'd hang out in my room playing video games or just talking about everything and nothing. But as Andy got older, he started to see the same thing I did, that aligning himself with Jim's world, and with Chad, kept him out of trouble. Slowly, Andy began to drift away from me too. I didn't blame him. He was just trying to survive the same way I was. I still remember the night that broke something in me. I'd been out with a friend and got home about an hour past curfew. I didn't think it was a big deal, but when I walked through the door, Jim was waiting for me. He was sitting in the living room, his face a storm cloud ready to let loose. "Do you think you could just walk in here whenever you feel like it?" He snapped, his voice sharp. I tried to keep calm, even though my throat felt tight. "I'm sorry." I lost track of time. Jim wasn't interested in hearing me out. He launched into a tirade about respect and how I was the problem child in the house. I glanced at my mom, hoping for a lifeline, but she just looked away, clearly uncomfortable and unwilling to get involved. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw Chad leaning against the hallway wall, smirking like he was watching his favorite show. Andy stood at the top of the stairs, looking torn, but he stayed silent. It felt like the whole house was against me. All because I was just me. I wasn't Chad. I didn't fit Jim's mold of the perfect son. I didn't fit their idea of what a family was supposed to look like. After that night, I started staying away as much as I could. I found excuses to be anywhere but home, studying late, joining after-school clubs, even pretending to go to a friend's house when I was really just wandering the neighborhood. Anything was better than being there. My grades started slipping, but I didn't care. My only motivation was to survive until I could leave for good. Then things got messy, I stumbled onto a secret my mom had been hiding for years. One day, I overheard her on the phone. She was talking to someone in hushed tones, her voice low and serious. I couldn't make out much, but what I did hear made my stomach drop. It wasn't just a friendly chat. Curious and desperate to know what was going on, I started digging. What I found blew my mind. My mom had been in contact with my biological dad for years, and she'd never told me. The man I thought had vanished, the one I convinced myself didn't care about me, had actually been reaching out. He wanted to be part of my life, and my mom had kept that from me. When I confronted her, I expected an apology, or at least an explanation. Instead, she looked at me like I was the one out of line. "I did what was best for you," she said, her voice sharp and defensive. "Your father, he's not the man you think he is." "What does that mean?" I shot back. "Why didn't you tell me he was trying to reach out?" She wouldn't answer me. All I got were vague statements about how he had problems, and how Jim was a better father figure. But I didn't want a replacement. I wanted the truth. I wanted to know my real dad. After that, things between my mom and me fell apart completely. I couldn't look at her without feeling betrayed. She'd lied to me for years. She'd let me feel alone and unwanted, all because it was easier for her to maintain the illusion of a happy blended family. It was like I didn't matter. When I turned 18, I finally got my chance to meet my dad. My mom wasn't thrilled, but she couldn't legally stop me. His name was Brian, and he wasn't what I expected at all. He wasn't perfect, but he had a warmth to him that I'd never experienced with Jim. He listened to me, really listened. For the first time, I felt like someone cared about what I had to say. I told him everything, all the things I'd never dared to say before. It felt like a weight lifting off my chest. But reconnecting with him came with its own consequences. When Jim found out, he lost it, accusing me of betraying the family. My mom tried to mediate, but it was obvious she resented me for stirring things up. Even Andy, who had been my closest ally, started drifting further away. Chad, of course, made no effort to hide his disdain. To him, my relationship with Brian was just further proof that I wasn't loyal to the family, as if I'd ever really been part of it. Eventually, I made the hardest decision of my life. I moved in with my dad. It wasn't easy, but I couldn't stay in that house any longer. I knew it would change everything, that I'd probably lose whatever fragile connection I still had with my mom and brothers. But I needed a fresh start. My dad's place was small, a far cry from the house I'd grown up in, but it felt more like home than anywhere else ever had. For the first time, I didn't feel like I had to apologize for existing. I could just be me. No titoing. No waiting for the next fight. No constant, passive-aggressive comments. It wasn't perfect, but it was mine. Won a prize. "Hey, Dad," Chad said, practically glowing with pride as he strolled into the kitchen. Jim's face lit up as he slapped Chad on the back, beaming like Chad had just won the lottery. Meanwhile, I sat there unnoticed, invisible. It was like I had vanished from the room entirely. I glanced at Mom, hoping she'd say something, anything, to acknowledge me. But as usual, she buried her face in the newspaper, staring at it like it held the meaning of life. That was Mom's specialty, avoiding confrontation, letting Jim walk all over me so she didn't have to rock the boat. The familiar knot of resentment tightened in my chest. But I bit my tongue and turned my focus back to my breakfast, forcing myself to swallow both the food and the humiliation. The worst part? The constant jabs at my interests. I was always more of a quiet kid, happiest when I had a pencil, a book, or a paintbrush in hand. Art and writing were my safe havens, places I could retreat to when the world around me felt hostile. But to Jim, my interests were strange, and worse, they were useless. He didn't understand me, so he dismissed me. "You need to be out there doing something productive," he'd say whenever he caught me sketching or writing. "All this scribbling doesn't mean anything. Look at Chad. He's learning real-world skills." One weekend, I spent hours working on a painting I was proud of. It was an abstract piece, swirls of color that somehow captured how I felt on my best days. Hopeful, alive, untethered. I propped it up in my room so I could see it first thing every morning. That afternoon, Jim walked in without knocking. He took one look at the painting, barely pausing before shaking his head with a disapproving scoff. "What's that even supposed to be? Art doesn't get you anywhere, Alex. You should be like Chad. He's learning business strategies. Focus on something that actually has a future." Mom passed by in the hallway just then. I caught her eye, silently begging for her to say something, to defend me, but all she gave me was a tight, nervous smile before disappearing into another room. The sting of humiliation crept up my neck like heat. It didn't matter how hard I tried. Nothing I did would ever be good enough. Jim had his favorites, and I wasn't one of them. I started spending more and more time in my room. Art became my escape. The one place where I wasn't a failure, where no one could tell me I wasn't enough. Then there was the barbecue. Jim loved his big family events. He invited neighbors, friends, and even Chad's basketball teammates. It was a chance for him to show off his perfect little family. Naturally, I got roped into helping with setup while Chad and his friends lounged around, cracking jokes and playfully shoving each other. At one point, Chad and his buddies were horsing around near the grill. I had just set out a tray of burgers when one of them bumped into the table, sending the platter crashing to the ground. Jim stormed over to check on the commotion. One look at the mess, and his anger snapped onto me like a spotlight. "Alex, can't you do anything right?" he spat, his voice sharp enough to cut. "You're supposed to be helping, not making things worse." It wasn't me. It was Chad and his friends. I tried to explain, my voice barely audible over the noise of the gathering. Jim didn't care. He muttered something about responsibility and reliability, dismissing my words like they didn't matter. Mom was right there, standing close enough to hear everything. But she just smiled nervously at the guests and carried on like nothing happened. Like I wasn't being humiliated in front of a yard full of people. That was the moment I knew. I was completely alone in that house. Jim's disdain only grew worse as time went on. One evening, after Chad scored top marks on his finals, Jim threw him a little celebration. He presented Chad with a brand new watch, complete with a proud speech about hard work and dedication. I sat there clapping half-heartedly, feeling more like an outsider than ever. Jim caught my eye as he finished his speech, and for a moment his expression was smug, like he knew exactly how I felt, like he was enjoying it. The breaking point came during a family vacation. Jim had rented a cabin by the lake, and it was supposed to be a bonding experience. What it turned into was just another opportunity for Jim and Chad to play sports, go fishing, and take endless photos together. Meanwhile, I was left to babysit Lacey, who wanted nothing to do with me. One night, we were sitting around the fire pit, and Jim started telling stories about Chad's accomplishments. Every trophy, every medal. When he got to me, he just shrugged. And Alex, well, he has his own way of doing things, Jim said, chuckling under his breath. The whole family laughed along with him. Even Mom. She gave me that same apologetic smile, as if that was supposed to make it better. I felt like the ground had been ripped out from under me. It was in that moment I knew I couldn't keep doing this. I couldn't keep living in a house where I was treated like I didn't exist, where my own mother wouldn't stand up for me. I started saving up money wherever I could. I worked odd jobs, hoarded whatever I earned, and planned my escape. It didn't matter where I went. Anywhere would be better than this. One night, as I was sitting in my room sketching, Lacey barged in without knocking. Her face was twisted with disdain. "Why are you always hiding in here?" she sneered. "You're so weird, Alex. No wonder Dad doesn't like you." I froze, my pencil hovering above the page. The anger bubbled up inside me, but I forced myself to stay calm. It wasn't her fault. Not really. She'd been raised to see me as the outsider, the family disappointment. But that was it. That was the moment I made up my mind. I wasn't going to let them define me anymore. I wasn't going to wait around for Mom to finally defend me, or for Jim to accept me. I was done. Leaving home wasn't a choice anymore. It was a necessity. After graduating high school, I was convinced that my only way forward was to carve out a life of my own. Jim told me I was making a mistake, that I'd come crawling back when the real world chewed me up and spit me out. But I didn't care. I'd been saving every penny from my part-time job, and by August, I'd found a tiny apartment downtown. It wasn't glamorous, just an old brick building with creaky stairs and an elevator that looked like it was ready to fail. But it was mine. That August morning, with my bags packed in the back of my car, I left. The drive felt surreal. I was free, but I could still hear Jim's voice echoing in my head, planting doubts that I tried to push away. When I opened the door to my apartment for the first time, I let out a shaky breath. It was small, a single room with a kitchenette and a narrow bathroom. But it was a palace to me. It was mine. For the first time, I didn't have to answer to anyone. I could just be myself. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like I could breathe. The whirlwind of adjusting to my new life hit me harder than I expected. I quickly realized I'd taken so many things for granted back home. Laundry, grocery shopping, even something as mundane as setting up utilities. It all felt like uncharted territory. I spent hours hunched over a notebook, breaking down my expenses and trying to stretch every dollar. But despite my best efforts, I always seemed to come up short. The money I thought would last me a few months vanished within weeks. Independence lost its charm pretty quickly when I was working nonstop just to make ends meet. I picked up as many shifts as I could at the cafe down the street, leaving the apartment before sunrise and getting back late at night. Most nights, I was too exhausted to think, and yet I couldn't sleep. Worry gnawed at me about rent, bills, and whether I could keep it all together. Just when I thought I was managing, even if just barely, life decided to throw me another curveball. It was a chilly October evening when my phone buzzed with a message from Chad. I hadn't spoken to him in months, so his name alone caught me off guard. The text was short and uncharacteristically formal. Alex, Dad's in the hospital. Might be serious. You should come by. Chad wasn't one for pleasantries, so if he was reaching out, I knew things must be bad. The hospital felt surreal, its sterile hallways amplifying the knot of anxiety in my chest. When I finally stepped into Jim's room, I almost didn't recognize him. He looked smaller, somehow weaker. His pride, though, was still intact, sharp and unyielding even from a hospital bed. Chad was sitting next to him, quiet but attentive, while Andy leaned casually against the wall. Neither of them had changed much. Andy still carried himself like the golden boy, and Chad still wore that smug indifference like armor. Jim turned his head toward me, his gaze lingering like he was sizing me up. "Didn't think you'd actually show up," he said, his voice rough and jagged. "Chad said it was serious," I replied quietly. "So here I am." Jim's expression softened slightly. "Well, I appreciate the effort," he muttered, though it was hard to tell if he meant it or not. The days that followed blurred together. I started visiting regularly, out of some mixture of obligation and expectation. Chad and Andy were always there, almost in shifts, as though they were competing for the title of best son. Andy rarely spoke to me, though he'd give me these calculating looks, like he was trying to figure out why I bothered showing up at all. Chad, on the other hand, stuck to curt nods and awkward silences. One afternoon, I found both of them waiting for me in the hospital lobby. The air between us felt heavy, like they'd been discussing something I wasn't supposed to hear. Chad cleared his throat and finally looked at me. "Listen, Alex, there's something you should know," he said. "What is it?" I asked warily, my stomach tightening. Chad glanced at Andy, who looked down at his phone like he wanted to be anywhere else. "It's about Dad's will," Chad continued. "Given his condition, he's been working to settle things sooner rather than later." I froze, every muscle in my body going tense. "The will." Andy finally looked up, his voice clipped and matter-of-fact. "He's dividing everything between me and Chad." It hit me harder than I expected. "What about me?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Andy's gaze met mine, cold and dismissive. "Dad doesn't think you'd make the right choices with the money. He thinks you'd waste it." The words stung like a slap across the face. Even now, when he was frail and near the end, Jim still saw me as a failure. "So that's it," I said, my voice shaking despite my effort to hold it steady. "He just decided I'm out?" Chad shifted uncomfortably, looking away. "It's for the best, Alex. You know how he is. He just never understood you." I wanted to storm out, to leave them behind and let them have their broken family dynamic. But something rooted me to that chair. I knew that if I walked away, they'd see it as proof that Jim had been right about me all along. So I stayed, though every second felt like a test of my patience and pride. Jim's condition worsened. The visits turned into a waiting game, each one suffocating me with the weight of everything unsaid. Chad and Andy handled all the arrangements, coordinating with doctors and lawyers, making sure Jim's wishes were carried out. I didn't even try to insert myself into the process. What was the point? I knew I wasn't part of the plan. One evening, I finally broke. I waited until Chad and Andy left for the night, then sat down by Jim's bedside. He looked at me, his face tired but his pride still unmistakable. "Why did you leave me out?" I asked softly, my voice carrying the weight of years of resentment. Jim's gaze didn't waver. "You wouldn't understand, Alex. You've always been different. You never followed the path I laid out for you. But I'm still your son," I said, the frustration bubbling to the surface. "Why couldn't you just accept me?" Jim didn't answer. He turned his head away, as though looking at me was too much to bear. I'll never forget the day I learned I had inherited $10 million. The call came out of nowhere, from a lawyer's office I'd never heard of. I almost didn't answer, assuming it was another scam. But something made me pick up. "Is this Alex?" the voice on the other end asked. "Yes, this is Alex," I replied cautiously. The man introduced himself as Samuel Porter, a lawyer representing my Aunt Martha's estate. My Aunt Martha, my dad's sister. I barely knew her. She'd always been this quiet, eccentric woman who kept to herself, someone I'd only seen a handful of times as a kid. "I'm calling because your Aunt Martha recently passed away," Mr. Porter continued. And as it turns out, she left her entire estate to you. I almost dropped the phone. Her entire estate? I echoed, feeling like I'd been dropped into some alternate reality. Yes, Mr. Porter confirmed. It's valued at approximately $10 million. The words didn't feel real. Me? The unwanted, invisible kid who'd been pushed out of his own family? I could barely process it. Why me? I finally managed to ask. I understand this might be overwhelming, Mr. Porter said gently. There are details to go over, and I'd like to meet with you in person to explain the terms of the inheritance. We set up a meeting, and when I hung up, I just sat there, staring at the wall. My entire life, I'd been made to feel small, like I was never good enough, like I'd never amount to anything. And now, out of nowhere, here was my chance to prove them all wrong. But mixed in with the shock and excitement was something else. Guilt. Why me? Aunt Martha had other nieces and nephews, people who'd been part of her life. Why had she chosen me? The day of the meeting arrived, and I walked into the lawyer's office still feeling half-dazed, like I was waiting to wake up from a dream. Mr. Porter was polished and professional, his smile calm and reassuring as he gestured for me to sit. Let's get started, he said, pulling out a stack of papers. I took a deep breath, ready to hear everything, and still trying to understand why it had all come to me. His office was calm and polished, but I could barely focus as Mr. Porter explained the details of the inheritance. Aunt Martha's estate came with no strings attached, no clauses, no stipulations, no demands. She had simply chosen to leave everything to me, trusting that I would make good use of it. As we went through the paperwork, Mr. Porter handed me a letter, folded and sealed. She left this for you, he said gently. I think it might explain some things. My hands were trembling as I took it from him. I didn't read it right away. I waited until I was alone later that evening, sitting on my bed with nothing but the quiet hum of the city outside my window. The letter was brief, written in Aunt Martha's neat, deliberate handwriting. Dear Alex, I've watched you over the years. I saw how hard it was for you to feel like you belonged, how often you were made to feel like an outsider. I saw the favoritism. I saw how Jim pushed you aside. I know how it feels to be unwanted in your own family, because I was once in the same position. It nearly broke me. You deserve better than what you got, Alex. This inheritance is my way of giving you a chance, the chance I never had. Use it to build a life you're proud of. You are worth so much more than they ever gave you credit for. With love, Aunt Martha. Tears stung my eyes as I read those words. Aunt Martha had seen me, truly seen me, in a way no one else ever had. All those years I thought I was completely alone. Someone had been there, watching, caring, and believing in me. For the first time in my life, I felt understood. I felt seen. It didn't take long for news of the inheritance to spread. Within days, my phone was flooded with messages from people I hadn't heard from in years. Cousins I barely remembered, distant relatives suddenly eager to catch up, even old family friends pretending they'd always thought fondly of me. But the most surprising was the call from my mom. Alex, honey, she said, her voice unnaturally sweet. How are you? It's been so long. I didn't say anything, letting the silence stretch. I could hear the excitement under her fake warmth. She knew about the money. I heard about Aunt Martha. Such a shame, she continued. She was always so generous. The way she said it, with that note of expectation, made me sick. What do you want, Mom? I cut her off, my voice colder than I intended. But I didn't regret it. There was a pause before she laughed awkwardly. What? Alex, I don't want anything. I just thought maybe we could talk, reconnect. You know, as a family. Family. The word felt like a slap. Where was this family when I needed them? When Jim belittled me and she stood silent. When they pushed me out of their lives and made me feel like I didn't matter. Over the next few days, the calls kept coming. Jim left a clipped, emotionless voicemail about bygones being bygones. Chad sent a text claiming he wanted to clear the air. I deleted them all without responding. Andy, though, my younger brother, was different. When he called, I almost didn't pick up, afraid it would be more of the same. But when I heard his voice, there was nothing but genuine happiness. Alex, dude, that's amazing, he said, excitement bubbling over. I can't believe Aunt Martha left you all that. You deserve it, man. He didn't ask for anything. He didn't hint at grudges or guilt. He was just happy for me. For once, it felt like someone in my family truly cared about me without strings attached. With the inheritance, I finally had the freedom to start fresh. I bought a small place in a city far enough from my family to give me space, but close enough to feel grounded. It was quiet, peaceful mine. I invested in an art studio, something I'd always dreamed about but never thought possible. For the first time, I was building a life of my own. But the calls didn't stop. Mom tried guilt-tripping me, reminiscing about my teenage years and how she'd done her best to raise me. Even Lacey reached out, claiming she'd always admired me, as if we hadn't spent our childhoods on opposite sides of the battlefield. It was clear what they wanted: my money. To them, I wasn't a person. I was a golden ticket. Eventually, I changed my number, cutting off their access to me completely. I didn't owe them anything. Not my time, not my money, not even an explanation. Aunt Martha's gift had been for me alone, and I wasn't about to let anyone take it from me. The last message I ever got from Jim was a voicemail, his voice tight with frustration. "Alex, you're making a mistake. Family is family, and you can't just throw us away. You'll regret this." I listened to the message once before deleting it. Family wasn't about blood. It was about loyalty, love, and respect. All things they had never given me. For the first time, I felt free. I hired a financial advisor, a quiet, sharp-minded woman named Sarah who patiently guided me through investments and savings. With her help, I began building a future I could be proud of. I invested in things that mattered to me: a local art studio for struggling artists, a scholarship fund for kids from troubled backgrounds, and even a couple of small businesses run by friends who'd supported me without expecting anything in return. Every time I walked into my art studio, the light streaming through the windows and the smell of fresh paint filling the air, I thought of Aunt Martha. I thought of her letter, her belief in me when no one else had cared to look. Her gift wasn't just about the money. It was about freedom. Freedom to live on my own terms, to prove that I was worth something, to build a life I was proud of. And that's exactly what I was going to do.